Hey y'all, welcome to Sandy's Library. I'm Sandy.
And I'm Sara. In today's video, we're gonna continue my great-grandparents' story.
And don't forget about our dogs, y'all. And the cat too. They can be noisy sometimes, so please ignore them. Alright, let's go ahead and delve right in.
On June 26, 1930, Sissy gave birth to twins, Lawrence Edwin and my grandmother Florence Evelyn. He was named after Sissy's father, William Lawrence Williams, and she was named after Irwin's deceased sister, Flora Phillips. They were born at the house my mom grew up in the back bedroom off the kitchen.
Our half-cousin was rather confused about this story, so we're going to tell it to you straight. My Uncle Lawrence was born first. He was a smaller baby and wasn't breathing. The doctor thought he was dead, so he tossed Uncle aside and went back to attending Sissy, who was busy about to give birth to my mother. So, when Uncle hit the wall, I guess it was kind of like that slap that doctors sometimes give babies to get them breathing, because he started wailing.
Another story that I've heard Uncle tell is about Sissy being Grandma Fuller's favorite grandchild. When he and my grandmother were old enough to need high chairs, Grandma Fuller gave Sissy the money to buy 2 of them so they wouldn't fight over a single high chair.
And y'all, I'm told that my mother and Uncle fought over everything. And Uncle, he was a prankster from the get-go. Wonder where he got that from. A Sissy, no doubt.
That'd be my guess.
The high chairs were purchased at Will Carpenter's store in Chatham. The price for the 2 chairs was $10. Will was married to Sissy's younger sister, Sally. Later on, he would become the president of the Chatham Bank, but that's another story for another time. For now, let's get back to Uncle's early pranks when he and my mother were little.
This next story had obviously been relayed to him because it took place when he and my grandmother were learning how to walk. He would step on her dress on purpose to make her trip and fall. So one day, Grandma Fuller caught him doing this. He'd say, "She spanked my butt good for me too." Then he'd laugh and say, "But I don't remember it."
Yep, Uncle Lawrence was quite the prankster.
During Aunt Allie's interview with our half-cousin, she described my great-grandmother as a wonderful person. When there was a sick person in the community, whether it was night or day, she'd go doctor them. She even delivered a few babies.
I know this to be true. I'd always heard that she delivered half the countryside of my mother's generation.
In late 1937, Connie and Thelma Fuller moved back to Louisiana. Connie was Sissy's first cousin. His father was her mother's youngest brother, Ed Fuller. Connie and Thelma made their home in Uncle Heman Fuller's old house.
And y'all, I have no idea where that was. And based on our half-cousin's inconsistencies with dates, we can't say for sure if it was really 1937 when they moved back to Louisiana. I mean, he has both my daughter's birth information wrong. And did he ever ask me to confirm said info before publishing it in his piece of shit manuscript? No, he did not. And now that we've got that straightened out, let's get back to the story.
What we do know for sure is that in November of 1937, Connie was active in the RLDS Church in West Washita Parish, where he was assistant to the then pastor Irwin Phillips, my great-grandfather. On the evening of November 28th, 1937, Connie was reading his Bible. It was getting late when Thelma said, "You'd better put that Bible down, get dressed, and go get the doctor." Obviously unaware, Connie asks why. Thelma replies, "Because I'm gonna have a baby." After Connie got dressed, Thelma told him to take Betty and Barney, their children, down to Ed Fuller's and bring Mimi and Sissy Phillips back with him. Connie did as he was told and then left Thelma in the capable hands of Sissy and Mimi while he went to fetch the doctor.
And they're talking about Annie Fuller, Ed Fuller's second wife. Everybody called her Mimi, including me. Connie was Ed's son by his first wife, Callie, and I've talked about her in one of the earlier videos. But anyway,
Connie and the doctor arrived just as Thelma was ready to deliver. Sissy assisted the doctor as Thelma gave birth to a daughter, Connie Colleen. When the doctor handed the baby off to Sissy, she called her Colleener and would always call Colleen that throughout her life. Every time the Fullers visited the Phillipses, if Colleen didn't ask for one of Sissy's baked sweet potatoes, she would ask Colleen if she wanted one. They say that Colleen loved Sissy's baked sweet potatoes. All the kids did.
I can vouch for that. Those things were so sweet and tasty, like candy. I loved Sissy's fried sweet potato sticks too. They also tasted like candy.
Thelma, Colleen's mother, said Sissy was always good to her. When Thelma was sick with cancer, she reported the doctor told her if she made it 5 years, she'd live. One day she saw a lady wearing a straw hat walking down the road, carrying a dishpan with a towel over it. As she approached the house, Thelma realized it was Sissy Phillips. Thelma said, "She cooked me the best dinner of turnip greens and the like." Thelma also said that Sissy made the best smoked sausages that she'd ever eaten, bar none the absolute best. She frequently told people, "I don't think you could buy any that would taste better."
I believe that. It was common knowledge in the community when I was a kid that Sissy was the best cook around. Of course, by the time the 70s rolled around, she wasn't smoking any kind of meats, as the Parkinsons had progressed too far by then. But she was still cooking, though, the same as she always had. She couldn't remember my name, but she never forgot a single recipe.
Our half-cousin says everyone loved to eat at Aunt Sis's house, knowing she'd cook a fantastic meal. On Sundays after church, there was always a crowd at her house for dinner.
And that's lunchtime for those of us who don't live in the South. Supper is the final meal of the day down there.
Sis really enjoyed the art of cooking and didn't want anyone around in the kitchen while she was preparing meals.
He must have gotten that from Aunt Allie, which is probably how she justified sitting on her ass while my grandmother waited on her hand and foot. Look, Sissy was a very social person. If we weren't visiting others, someone was always at our house. And Aunt Allie was the only person I ever saw sitting on her ass while Sissy slaved away in the kitchen. Well, her and Aunt Catherine. Yep, both Aunt Catherine and my mother Florence were two of the laziest people out there. I've heard stories from various people, including Sissy, about how when they were still living at home, they'd be tasked with washing the dishes. It's said that they'd put the pots and pans away inside the cabinets without washing them. How they figured that was going to work is beyond me. But Aunt Catherine was good to my kids, so she gets a pass. My mother, not so much. But anyway, we're going to go over the rest of the things our half-cousins said about Sissy and Grandpa and either confirm or refute them.
Sissy was a talented singer, and she had a good hand at sewing. After she married, she made lots of quilts.
That's true. She was still making quilts in the early 1960s. I vaguely recall those quilting parties with that huge quilting frame set up in the living room with several women seated around it piecing the quilt together. The quilting parties stopped in the late 1960s when the shaking in her left hand got so bad that it hindered her ability to control the sewing process. Okay, so what did he say next?
He says, I don't think Sis ever had a store-bought dress. She made all her own clothing. She never knew all the fine styles of her day. Sis just made everyday apparel. That's the only kind Irwin said they ever wore.
Okay, there is so much wrong with that statement. That may well have been the case early in their marriage. But by the time I came along, Grandpa had nice suits from JCPenney's that he wore to church and when he was performing his JP duties. And the rest of the time, he wore overalls from the store. And Sissy had plenty of store-bought dresses, too. We had a Singer sewing machine. I used it, and I saw Kathy use it, but I never saw Sissy using it. She didn't make my clothes. My clothes were all store-bought. I remember it well. Even my first time going to school, we'd go into Monroe, usually JCPenney's, in August, and buy me a couple of weeks' worth of school clothes and shorts, pants, and tops for home use. Now, one thing our half-cousin and I can agree on is this.
Sis loved flowers and cultivated them in her yard, which she maintained beautifully. She also planted lots of shrubbery in her yard.
Yep, we had 2 pecan trees, a walnut tree, 2 pomegranate trees, a hickory nut tree, 2 pear trees, persimmon trees, numerous plums and shrubs, including several camellias and a bounty of flowers and roses. Sissy's favorite flowers were daffodils and buttercups and a climbing rose that she called the Seven Sisters Rose. I dug up both of those about 10 years ago. Uncle Lawrence's wife helped me find a root ball for the rose. She wrapped that thing in a wet towel and we put it in a trash bag. I packed it and the bulbs in my suitcase and brought them home with me. The root ball made my suitcase so heavy I had to pay an extra $100 just to get my suitcase on the airplane. The best $100 I ever spent. My grandma's rose has flourished out here in the Nevada high desert, and so are the daffodils and buttercups.
Sis enjoyed reading magazines and the newspaper. One of the Phillips's favorite magazines was called Comfort.
That magazine must have lost its appeal by the 1960s, as I don't recall ever seeing it in our house. In fact, this is the first time I've ever heard of it. National Geographic was the one I remember most being at the house. That and Mad Magazine, but I digress.
Irwin and Sis owned one of the first refrigerators in the community. Her nephew Johnny Parrott said it was the first one he'd ever seen. It said that she was about the best blackberry picker around. She'd take a long stick to push the briars aside, fill up a gallon bucket with berries, and never get more than a few minor scratches.
Yeah, I remember going berry picking with her. She was very adept at navigating a blackberry patch, that's for sure.
Our half-cousin says Sis loved to fish about as much as any boy.
What? Girls aren't allowed to like fishing? It appears that our half-cousin was not only racist, but sexist as well. Nevertheless, what do you say next?
There was a stream down in the bottom where she caught all types of fish. Although Sis loved fishing, she didn't like to eat them.
No, she didn't. And by the early 1960s, there was a well-established fishing pond on our property. It was about a quarter of a mile back behind the house. And in the late 1970s, my uncle built a house next to the pond where he spent the remainder of his days, mostly until he fell and broke his hip a couple of years before he died on May 27, 2016.
His third wife, Annie Albritton Phillips, still lives there. Uncle Lawrence didn't have any children. He had a fever when he was a kid that left him sterile. That might be part of the reason why his first two marriages didn't work out. It was a first marriage for both women, and he couldn't give either of them children.
I don't have too many memories of Burl, his first wife. I was very young, and the memories that I do have aren't pleasant, but that's a story for another day. I was very close to his second wife, Helen. They married when I was around 4 or 5. She was very beautiful and quite glamorous, and she wanted children in the worst way. She was always talking about having a girl that she would name Laura after Uncle Lawrence. And it's sad because neither Verl nor Helen ever had children that I'm aware of. I've kept in touch with Helen over the years, so I know she didn't have any children. And as for Verl, she ended up marrying the brother of Aunt Catherine's husband, Bill Steele. So, I'm pretty sure Verl didn't have any kids either. Aunt Catherine would have told us if she had. She wouldn't have been able to stop herself. It's just as well, though. No child needed to be subjected to that woman. Uncle Lawrence did have 3 stepsons, though, through Annie, his third wife, all of whom I was very close to. I remember chatting with my mother on the phone as an adult, and she starts bad-mouthing my uncle's wife, Annie, a woman who she did not know at all. I shut her down quickly, reminding her that when I was in high school, we had a mother-daughter banquet, and Sissy was too sick to go with me, so Annie went with me. So I told her, don't say anything bad about Annie to me. My mother didn't like it, but whatever. She made that bed, and I made sure she laid in it, too. It's just like when she told me to call her Mom. And y'all, I was a grown-ass woman at the time. So I told her, I don't mean any disrespect. You gave birth to me, and I appreciate that. But my mom died in 1977, and I was talking about my grandmother, and she knew it. Aunt Catherine had 2 daughters. Kathy was born about 10 years before me. She was also raised by my grandparents. Aunt Catherine's second daughter, Jan, whose father was Bill Steele, is about 3 years younger than me. And as for Kathy, well, the story I always heard as a kid was that Kathy's father had died in a tragic accident before she was born. As an adult, though, and after both my grandparents had passed away, I heard a completely different story from numerous people of Aunt Catherine's generation. Now, I'm not saying the story I heard as an adult is what happened. I don't know that for sure. I wasn't there. But I am going to discreetly tell the story because I do believe it has merit, as it makes more sense than the story my grandparents told. And it's worth noting, y'all, that Grandpa and Sissy did not like family scandals. No. And they would do anything, sacrifice anyone's right to know the truth in the name of family honor. And I'm not knocking them, y'all. I love my grandparents. They raised me the best they could, and they taught me to be a free thinker. For that, I am eternally grateful. But they had flaws just like the rest of us, and one of their flaws was pride. But even as a teenager, I had an inkling that they were leaving something out of that story about my cousin's father having died before she was born. 'Cause see, Kathy wasn't the only grandchild who had an absentee father that supposedly died prior to said grandchild's birth. Well, as a published author of fiction, that all seems a little too convenient to me. I mean, they lied about my older half-brother Larry Joe's father. He did not die before my brother was born, like they said. I've told y'all before that I was a snoop. I went through all my grandfather's legal papers when I was 13 or 14 years old, and I found my mother's divorce decree from my half-brother's supposed father. So, they lied. And y'all, this has all made me wonder about my own father as an adult. But I am happy and thankful to report that my DNA test confirms that I am my father's daughter. But anyway, back to the story at hand. So, in a nutshell, Aunt Catherine was supposed to have spent the weekend in New Orleans with a certain gentleman who just so happened to be married to her double first cousin about 9 months before Kathy was born. They said that Aunt Catherine made up the name that's on Kathy's birth certificate because she didn't want to tell her parents who Kathy's biological father actually was. Now, this theory does go a long way toward deciphering a long-time family mystery for me. See, I had never understood why said cousin had always hated Aunt Catherine. But it was very clear to me, as a child, a teenager, and an adult, that she despised Aunt Catherine right up until said cousin's death in 2007. That's a long time to carry hatred in your heart. Oh, and it's worth noting, the cousin lost a set of twins in the 1940s and was never able to conceive again. Plus, there was never any real reason for the cousin's hatred of Aunt Catherine either. She didn't hate my mother or Uncle Lawrence, so... And y'all, I don't know if this story is true or not, but there's a reason why numerous people told me the same story at different times after my grandparents had passed on. Maybe Kathy can decipher what's what from her DNA test on Ancestry, but anyway, on with our half-cousin's biography.
The family always took stock in Sis's opinions and would always ask for her advice.
Yep, everybody loved my grandma.
Sis worked very hard all her life. She worked the fields, milked the cows, and did all the cooking, including making butter and smoking meats. They didn't have to buy any food because they produced everything they needed.
That's pretty much true. We rarely shopped for anything but the basics: flour, sugar, cornmeal, salt and pepper, spices, stuff like that. And this seems like a good place to end this video. There's much more to tell though, so we're not done with Sissy and Grandpa's stories.
Thanks for joining us today. We'll be back soon with part 4 of my great-grandparents' story.
Later, Gators.